9 years ago, Evelyn Cross disappeared in a single night. No farewell, no explanation, only a forged photograph and a letter threatening the life of her unborn child. 9 years later, the man she once loved, now an untouchable tycoon, walks into her small bookstore and sees a 9-year-old child with gray eyes just like his own. Like and comment with the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you glued to the page. The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Nora Bennett almost didn't answer it. She was in the back of the bookstore, crouched behind the counter, with a box of water-damaged paperbacks she'd been meaning to sort through for 3 weeks, her knees aching and her hair falling loose from the braid she'd started that morning. The phone buzzed against the wooden floor twice before she looked at it. Unknown number. Manhattan area code. She let it ring. It wasn't paranoia, she told herself. It was habit. 9 years of careful, deliberate habit. The kind that kept you breathing when breathing wasn't supposed to be an option anymore. The phone stopped. She went back to the paperbacks. Then it rang again. Same number. She pressed her thumb against the screen and held it to her ear without saying anything, waiting, the way she'd learned to wait for the sound of breathing on the other end first, the small tell that separated a wrong number from something worse. Miss Bennett? A man's voice, clipped, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone reading from a script. This is a courtesy call from Vale Acquisitions. We've completed our review of the Harwick property. That includes the commercial units on the ground floor and the residential above. The formal offer will arrive by certified mail Thursday morning. The terms are non-negotiable. Nora didn't move. We appreciate your cooperation, the voice continued. Mr. Vale asks that any questions be directed to our legal team. The line went dead. She sat on the floor of the bookstore for a long time after that, the phone face down in her lap, the fluorescent light above her humming its dull, steady note. Outside, the ocean was doing what it always did, pulling and pushing against the shore like it had somewhere better to be and kept changing its mind. She could hear it through the walls. She'd always been able to hear it. It was part of why she'd chosen this place. That and the fact that nobody who mattered would ever think to look for her here. She pulled herself upright using the counter edge, both hands gripping the wood, and stood in the narrow space between the shelves. The store was dark except for the back light and the faint amber glow bleeding through the front windows from the street lamps outside. From where she stood, she could see the children's section in the far corner. The low shelves, the beanbag chair Owen had picked out himself when he was 5, the handmade banner he'd painted last winter that said, "Books are portals" in crooked red letters because he'd run out of room and had to squeeze the S in at the end. Vale Acquisitions. She said the name out loud, quietly, to the empty store, the way you'd say the name of something you needed to confirm was real. Then she turned off the backlight and climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment above, and she didn't sleep. Owen was 9 years and 4 months old, and he had his father's eyes. Nora had known this from the moment he was born, had looked down at the small, furious, red-faced person screaming in her arms in a hospital in Portland under a name she'd only had for 3 weeks, and had seen Roman Vale looking back at her from a face the size of her 2 fists. It had broken something in her chest that she'd spent the better part of a decade carefully reconstructing around the fracture, like building a wall around a crack in the foundation and pretending the structure was sound. Owen didn't know about any of that. Owen knew his father had been someone his mom had loved, and that things hadn't worked out, and that some situations were complicated. He'd accepted this with the pragmatic equanimity of a child who'd grown up surrounded by books about orphans and lost boys and heroes who figured things out on their own, and he'd folded it into his understanding of the world the way he folded everything, quietly, thoroughly, without drama. He was also, at this exact moment, dragging a step stool across the fiction section so he could reach the top shelf, where he was convinced someone had misshelved a copy of a novel he'd been looking for since September. "It's not up there," Nora said from behind the register. "You don't know that. I checked yesterday." "You say that, but you also said the Alderman biography was in local history and it was in travel." "That was 1 time. It was 3 times, Mom. I kept a list." She looked up from the inventory spreadsheet she was pretending to work on. He had reached the top shelf and was running his finger along the spines with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something, his head tilted,
his lower lip caught between his teeth.
He had Roman's jaw. Roman's hands, long-fingered and careful. Roman's habit of going completely still when he was concentrating on something, like the rest of the world, simply ceased to exist. She had learned over 9 years not to look at him too long when he did that. "Come down," she said. "We open in 10 minutes. One more second. Owen. One. More. Second." She let him have it because she always did, because she had never in her life been able to hold a hard line with him when he was like this, focused and certain and completely at home in this place she'd built for them, out of stubbornness and secondhand shelving and a down payment borrowed from a woman named Clara, who ran the diner 2 blocks over and had never once asked for a reason. The bell above the door chimed at 9:02, and the first customers of the day came in. Margaret Fell, 73, who came every Wednesday for the large print mysteries, and to argue mildly about whether Nora stalked enough Scandinavian crime, and her granddaughter Bex, who was 7 and was working her way through every book with an animal on the cover in strict alphabetical order by author. The morning moved the way mornings always moved, slow and familiar, the particular rhythm of a small store in a small town where most of the customers knew the owner by name, and half of them had known Owen since he was small enough to sleep in the back office in a portable crib while she ran the register. It was ordinary, deliberately, carefully ordinary. She had spent 9 years making it ordinary. The letter arrived Thursday, as promised. She read it at the kitchen table while Owen was at school, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her and the sound of the ocean coming through the window she always left cracked in the mornings. The letter was 4 pages, dense with legal language she had to read twice, but the shape of it was simple enough. Vale Acquisitions had purchased the Harwick property. The entire block, it turned out, not just the building she occupied. The acquisition had been finalized 6 weeks ago through a series of holding companies. The current lease on Coastal Pages books would be honored through the end of its term, 14 months away. After that, the property would be redeveloped. There was a number at the bottom for the legal team. There was also, at the top of the letterhead, a small logo, a stylized V inside a circle. Clean, minimal, expensive looking. She knew that logo. She'd seen it years ago in another life, in a different city, on the side of a building she'd walked past every day for 2 years, thinking it was just another piece of the skyline. She hadn't known then what it meant, what it represented, the layers of structure underneath it like an iceberg, the legitimate businesses at the surface and the rest of it below, old and cold and vast. She put the letter down very carefully on the table. Then she picked up her phone and called Clara. "I need a favor," she said when Clara answered. "I need you to look something up for me." "What kind of something?" "Vale Acquisitions, New York." A pause. She could hear the diner in the background, the clatter of morning service. "Nora," Clara said slowly. "That name sounds familiar." "I know. Roman Vale. I've seen him in the news, business section mostly." "Sometimes the other sections." Another pause. "Nora, is that—" "Don't," Nora said. "Just look it up. Tell me what you find." What Clara found was public record, and all of it confirmed what Nora already knew in the place beneath knowing, the place that had gone cold and silent the moment she'd heard the name on the phone 3 nights ago. Roman Vale, 41. CEO of Vale Group, a Manhattan-based holding company with interests in real estate, logistics, private security, and finance. Named to multiple business lists. Photographed at charity events, in boardrooms, occasionally in federal court documents as a person of interest in investigations that never seemed to result in charges. The articles used words like formidable and controversial. One profile from a magazine that specialized in that particular brand of reverent menace called him the last of a vanishing kind. There were photographs. She didn't look at them for long. None of the articles mentioned what he'd been at 32 when she'd known him. None of them mentioned the apartment on the west side where he'd kept a record player and a shelf of books he'd read so many times the spines had gone white. None of them mentioned the way he'd said her name, her real name, Evelyn, with the particular weight of someone who understood that a name could be a declaration. She closed her laptop. She went downstairs to the store, and she unlocked the front door, and she turned the sign from closed to open, and she told herself what she always told herself when the past came close enough to touch. Not today. You can fall apart tomorrow. Today you have a store to run, and a kid to pick up from school at 3, and a life you built with your own hands that no one is going to take from you. She believed it mostly. She almost believed it. He arrived on a Friday. She knew it was him before she saw him clearly, which was its own specific kind of cruelty. The way the body remembers things the mind has worked so hard to bury. She was in the back, cutting open a box of new inventory, and she heard the bell above the door, heard footsteps that were heavier than the usual morning traffic, heard the quality of silence that settled differently when someone entered a room who was accustomed to having the room rearrange itself around them. She straightened up, turned around. He was standing at the end of the center aisle, and he looked exactly like the photographs and nothing like them, the way people always do when you've only seen them in 2 dimensions, and suddenly they're standing in front of you taking up actual space. Taller than she remembered, though she knew that wasn't possible. He was the same height he'd always been, 6'2", and the gray at his temples was new, and the set of his jaw was harder, and the suit he was wearing cost more than her monthly rent. But underneath all of that, underneath the 9 years and everything they'd done to both of them, he was the same. He was looking at the shelves. He hadn't seen her yet. She had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision, and she used 2 of them standing completely still with a box cutter in her hand and her heart doing something violent against her ribs before she set the cutter down on the counter very quietly and walked toward him because running was not an option. Not here, not in her store, not in the life she had chosen on purpose. "Can I help you find something?" Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He turned. The moment his eyes found her face, everything in him went absolutely still. That same stillness she remembered, the one that meant he was recalibrating, processing, the one that in 9 years of trying to forget him, she had never been able to accurately describe to herself, except as the feeling of a held breath. "Evelyn," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, just her name, in his voice, in the particular way he'd always said it, and the sound of it after 9 years of being someone else was like pressing on a bruise she'd forgotten she had. "My name is Nora," she said. "Bennett, if you're here about the lease, I'm not here about the lease. Then I need you to leave." He didn't move. Of course he didn't. Roman Vale had never in his life moved because someone told him to. She had found that quality electrifying once. Standing here now, she found it exhausting in a way that went straight to the bone. "You look," he started. "Don't." 9 years, Evelyn. "Don't call me that." He looked at her for a long moment, and she made herself hold the eye contact because looking away first was something she had decided she would not do, even if holding it felt like standing too close to something that was still burning. "Why?" he said. The word was very quiet. The quieter he got, she remembered, the more dangerous it was. Not dangerous to her. He had never been dangerous to her, not in that way, but dangerous in the way of something structural giving way. "Why did you run?" "I looked for you. 2 years. I had people looking. Every lead went cold. I thought—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that she didn't want to name. "I thought you were dead. I needed you to think that." "Why?" The bell above the door chimed. They both turned. Owen came in sideways, the way he always did, backpack hanging off one shoulder, a book already open in his other hand, talking before he'd fully crossed the threshold because that was also something he always did. "Mom, Mrs. Pelham said I could borrow the second one too if I finished this one by Friday, and I told her I'd definitely finish it by Friday, but I need you to not make me go to bed before 10, at least on—" He stopped. He looked up from the book. His eyes, Roman's eyes, gray and clear and direct, moved from his mother to the stranger standing in the middle of the store. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. To Nora, it lasted the rest of her life. She watched Roman Vale look at her son, watched him take in the jaw, the eyes, the long-fingered hand still holding the book open, the particular quality of stillness that had descended over Owen the way it always did when he was trying to read a situation he didn't have enough information for. She watched Roman's face do the mathematics. "Owen," she said, keeping her voice even by force of will she hadn't known she still possessed. Go upstairs. Owen didn't move immediately. He was looking at Roman with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to disguise his observations. Who's that? A business associate. Go upstairs, please. A beat. Owen closed his book. He looked at Roman one more time, that long, gray-eyed look. And then he disappeared through the door at the back of the store that led to the staircase. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs was very loud in the silence. Roman turned back to her. His face had changed. Something had settled into it that she recognized from a long time ago. The look he'd had when a decision had been made and the only remaining question was execution. How old is he? Roman said. It wasn't a question. She held his gaze and she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, because the mathematics had already been completed and the answer was sitting on both of their faces and had been sitting there, she understood now, from the moment Owen had walked through the door. Evelyn. His voice had dropped to something she'd never heard from him before. Something that wasn't anger, wasn't coldness, wasn't anything in his considerable repertoire of controlled force, something rawer than any of that. How old is he? The ocean moved outside the walls of the store. She said, 9, and the last wall came down. The word landed in the store the way a stone lands in still water. And then the ripples started, and there was no taking it back. 9. Roman didn't move. That was the thing about him she'd forgotten and remembered simultaneously. The way he processed catastrophic information without externally collapsing. The way the stillness deepened instead of breaking, like a structure that had been struck and was deciding whether to stand or fall. His jaw tightened. The muscles along the side of his neck shifted. He breathed once, audibly, through his nose. That was all. Then he said, You need to close the store. Excuse me. Right now, close it. He moved to the front door. Not fast, not aggressive, but with that particular economy of motion she remembered. Nothing wasted, everything deliberate. And he flipped the sign himself. Open to closed. He turned the deadbolt. Nora's hand went flat on the counter. You don't get to come in here and... There are 2 men sitting in a black SUV across the street who have been there since I walked in. His voice was quiet and entirely without inflection. That's my security, standard. But if someone has been tracking my movements, and someone has, for the last 6 weeks, which is why I'm here personally instead of sending counsel, then they know where I am right now, which means they know where this store is, which means... He stopped, looked at the staircase door. Which means we don't have a lot of time to stand here doing this. She stared at him. Close the store, Evelyn. Stop calling me that. That's your name. Not anymore. She came around the counter, keeping space between them, moving to the window to look for herself. The black SUV was there, exactly where he'd said. Tinted windows. Engine idling. Who's tracking you? That's a longer conversation. Then start it. He looked at her with something that might have been respect and might have been frustration, and was probably both. Then he pulled out his phone and typed something brief, and the SUV's engine cut. My men will secure the perimeter. We have maybe 20 minutes before someone notices this location, and I need you to listen to me without what? Without doing what you're already doing. What am I doing? Planning how to run. The words hit her somewhere unarmored, and she hated that they did. Hated that he could still read her that precisely. Hated that 9 years and a complete reconstruction of herself hadn't changed the fact that he knew the particular quality of her stillness that preceded flight. Talk, she said. He talked. She stood behind the counter because she needed something solid between them. Not because she was afraid of him, she told herself, but because the geography of it mattered. The 6 feet of wooden counter that meant she was on her side and he was on his. And she listened without interrupting, which cost her more than she let show. 6 weeks ago, a series of financial irregularities had surfaced in the Vail Group's acquisition pipeline. Transactions that had been routed through holding companies he didn't recognize, signed off on by a secondary authorization he hadn't issued. Someone inside his organization had been running a parallel operation, siphoning assets, falsifying records, building a shadow structure inside the legitimate business he'd spent years constructing on top of what his father had left him. He'd started pulling the thread. The thread led to the Harwick property, not because of the real estate. The acquisition itself was clean, legitimate, one of 40 that year. But because buried in the title search attached to the property records was a notation that had been added and removed and added again over the span of 3 years. A flag on the residential unit above the commercial space. A flag attached to a surveillance record. Someone had been watching this address. Someone had been watching her. Nora's hands were flat on the counter, and she was very carefully not reacting visibly to any of this. For how long? 3 years, at minimum. Possibly longer. He said it without inflection, but something underneath it was taut as wire. Photographs, logs, records of the store's business activity, inventory purchases, the school Owen attends, his schedule. She felt the cold start at the back of her neck and move down her spine one vertebra at a time. The person doing this is someone named Silas Mercer, Roman continued. He was my chief strategist for 7 years. He left the organization 14 months ago, ostensibly to pursue private consulting. I believed him. And now? And now I believe he spent those 14 months building a case for why I should no longer be in a position to make decisions for the organization. And I believe part of that case... He stopped. The jaw worked. Part of that case involves you. And Owen. The name in his mouth. She'd never heard him say it before. He said it like he was testing the weight of something new, something he didn't have calibration for yet. Why? She said. Why would Owen matter to him? Roman looked at her steadily. Because if Owen is my son, he is, then he's an heir. The word sat between them. Nora understood it the way you understood things that were always true even when you'd refused to look at them. Immediately, completely, with a kind of cold clarity that bypassed the emotional processing and went straight to consequence. An heir. In the world Roman occupied, the world she'd fled 9 years ago, an heir was not a child. An heir was a liability. An heir was leverage. An heir was a reason. I need you to tell me, Roman said, about the photograph. She blinked. What photograph? The one that made you run. The silence extended for several seconds. She heard the ocean outside. She heard the refrigerator in the back office cycling on. She heard her own breathing, which was more controlled than it had any right to be. How do you know about that? Because I've been trying to find you for 9 years, and 6 weeks ago I found a file instead. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something inside it had shifted, the way a fault line shifts. Invisible, and then catastrophic. A file that contained a copy of a photograph of me, at a function I don't remember attending, with a woman I have never met, signed by a notary I can't locate. And a letter. He paused. What did the letter say, Evelyn? What exactly did it say? She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, that if I stayed, we'd both die. You and the baby. She kept her voice flat. That you'd already made your choice. That you'd taken the throne and the woman in the photograph was part of the arrangement, and that I was a liability you'd chosen to ignore, which meant someone else was going to handle it for you. Something in Roman's face did something she had no word for. It said, she continued, because she'd started and stopping felt worse than finishing, that the only way to keep the child safe was to disappear. That if you ever found out about the pregnancy, about any of it, the child would be used against you and then disposed of. Those were the exact words, disposed of. She heard the phrase in her own voice and felt the old cold fear move through her like a current. I believed it. I believed it because the photograph looked real, and the letterhead was real. And I was 26 years old, and alone, and I was 3 months pregnant, and... She stopped. And I believed it. Roman Vale, who commanded a multi-million-dollar empire and had sat across negotiating tables from men who would have cheerfully removed him from the earth, looked like he had been hit by something moving at speed. That photograph, he said, was fabricated. I have never attended a function at that location. The woman in it, we identified her last month. She's a contract model. She was paid, in cash, through an account traced back to a shell company registered to a Silas Mercer associate. The refrigerator cycled off. In the silence that followed, Nora heard the staircase creak. They both looked at the door. Owen appeared in the doorway with the particular non-subtlety of a 9-year-old who had been listening from the stairs and had decided that the listening part was over and the being present part should now begin. He was still holding his book. He'd put on different socks at some point, the ones with the small dinosaurs, which she'd bought him for his birthday and which he wore exclusively when he was feeling some way he hadn't categorized yet. He looked at Roman. He looked at Nora. "Are you in trouble?" he said to her, with the directness that she'd tried to gentle and eventually given up on because it was as fundamental to him as his gray eyes and his careful hands. "Because you have your trouble face." "I don't have a trouble face." "You do. It's the one where your eyebrows don't move." He looked back at Roman. "Who are you?" Roman said nothing for a beat. Then quietly, "My name is Roman." "Are you a business associate?" "Your mother said that, yes." Owen absorbed this with visible skepticism. "She says that about people she doesn't want to explain." He looked between them again with that unnerving gray assessment. "You look like someone," he said to Roman. "Owen," Nora started, "I can't figure out who yet, but you look like someone I know." He frowned, not distressed, just genuinely puzzling it through. "Do you know what I mean? When someone looks familiar but you don't have a name for why?" Roman's throat moved. "Yeah," he said very quietly. "I know what you mean." "Owen, go back upstairs." Nora's voice came out steady because she had become, in 9 years of solitary parenthood, very practiced at steadiness on the outside, regardless of what was happening on the inside. "I'll be up in a few minutes. There's food in the refrigerator." Owen looked at Roman for one more long moment. Then he said, "Okay," and disappeared back through the door, and his footsteps went up the stairs without hurrying, which meant he'd probably stop at the landing and keep listening. She and Roman both knew this and said nothing about it. "He's mine," Roman said. "Not an accusation, not a question. Something else. A recognition arriving in stages, each stage requiring its own adjustment." "Yes." "You raised him alone." "Yes. For 9 years. I'm aware of how long it's been." Nora. The name. Her chosen name. He used it deliberately, and she understood the deliberateness. He was meeting her where she was instead of where he wanted her to be, and that small gesture cracked something she'd been keeping sealed. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to understand that. Whatever you think You own my building," she said. "You showed up in my store. There are men outside who work for you. Understand why telling me you're not here to take anything doesn't land the way you intend it." He took the hit without deflecting. "Fair. And I need to know what Silas Mercer wants, specifically, not generally, not eventually. Right now I need to know what he actually wants from this." Roman was quiet for a moment. "Control of the organization. He's been building toward a takeover for years. The legitimate business I've built makes that harder than it would have been 5 years ago. Too many public-facing components, too much scrutiny. He needs leverage, something that makes the cost of resistance higher than the cost of compliance." "Owen." "Yes." She let that sit. Let herself feel the full shape of it. Not the fear, not yet, but the structure of the threat, the logic of it. The cold calculation that had looked at a child who didn't know his own name for the first 9 years of his life and seen an asset. "What do you need from me?" she said. Roman blinked. She'd surprised him. She could see it, the small shift in his posture, the recalibration. "I expected more resistance," he said. "I'm not done resisting. I'm asking what you need because if Silas has known where I am for 3 years, then resistance to you is secondary to the problem of him." She met his eyes. "What do you need?" "Time and cooperation, and for you to not disappear again." "I won't run." She said it and meant it and hated that she meant it because running had kept her and Owen alive and safe for 9 years, and the part of her that had built this life around the principle of controlled escape was screaming. "But I need something from you." "Name it." "The truth. All of it. Not the version that protects your operation, not the version that makes me compliant. The truth, in order, with nothing left out." She held his gaze. "Starting with why Silas wanted you vulnerable. Starting with what he knew 9 years ago, that made him choose that particular moment to break us apart. Roman's expression shifted into something she read as reluctant and honest simultaneously. The face of a man who was going to tell her something he'd have preferred not to say. Silas knew, Roman said, because I told him. The silence that followed was very loud. You told him about me? I told him I was leaving. I told him I'd found someone, and that I was done with the life, and that I intended to walk away from everything my father built. He said it without softening it, giving it to her straight the way she'd asked for. He was the only person I trusted with that. He was the only person, at that point, who I considered. He paused. I told him. And within 2 weeks, you were gone. She stared at him. He used what I gave him, Roman said. My trust, my weakness. He used it the same way he uses everything, precisely and without hesitation. A muscle in his jaw moved. I spent 3 years after you left trying to understand what I'd done wrong, trying to understand how I'd missed the signal. I took on the Empire because there was nothing else left, because I thought you'd chosen to leave and the Empire was all that remained. He stopped. I built the thing I was trying to escape, because he took away the reason to leave. She needed a moment. She took it, turning slightly away from him, looking at the shelves, at the spines of the books she'd arranged and rearranged over 9 years, at the children's section with Owen's crooked banner, at the ordinary accumulated evidence of the life she'd constructed from the wreckage of a lie. You said 6 weeks ago you started finding irregularities, she said, when she had herself back under control. What changed 6 weeks ago? Why did he move now? Because... Roman stopped. Something shifted in his expression that she hadn't seen before, something careful and deliberate being set aside in favor of something more exposed. Because I started moving assets, quietly, liquidating certain holdings, restructuring others, the kind of restructuring that looks like preparation, like someone getting ready to step back. He met her eyes. I found a private investigator's report in the file, dated 3 months ago, a photograph. Her breath stalled. Not a fabricated one, he said. A real one, taken from across the street. She knew before he said it. Of the store. Of Owen, outside the store, on a Tuesday afternoon, stacking books on the sidewalk cart. His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. He's been watching you for 3 years, and 3 months ago, when I started making moves that looked like I was preparing to leave the Empire again, he stopped. He started making moves of his own. The bell above the door didn't chime, the door didn't open, but from the street outside, through the gap in the curtain over the front window, Nora watched a second black vehicle pull slowly to the curb behind Roman's SUV. It wasn't the same color, and it wasn't Roman's men who got out. She had been running from something for 9 years, and she had told herself 10 minutes ago that she wouldn't run again, and now she was standing in her store watching 2 men in dark coats move from a vehicle that didn't belong to Roman toward the front door of the building, and her body was doing the thing it had been trained by 9 years of vigilance to do. Inventory, assess, calculate, survive. Roman, she said very quietly. He had already seen them. He was already moving toward her, one hand reaching back for something at his hip, the other hand extended toward her in the flat-palmed signal she recognized from a language she'd learned in another life. Stay. And upstairs, above them both, a door creaked. Owen's footsteps crossed the floor. The footsteps stopped directly above the front window, and one of the men on the sidewalk looked up. Roman moved first. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, put himself between her and the front window with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years making that particular calculation. Who goes in front? Who gets protected? How much time does the glass buy before it stops buying anything? And his hand found her wrist, not gripping, just contact, a point of navigation. Back door, he said. There isn't one. There has to be. It's a bookstore. There's a supply entrance off the alley, but it's padlocked from the outside, and the key is... Where? Office, pegboard, orange keychain. He was already moving, pulling his phone with his free hand, typing something without looking at the screen, the way people did when the muscle memory was deep enough to run without supervision.
She went with him because the alternative was standing in the front window while two men whose vehicles she didn't recognize finished crossing the sidewalk toward her door. The office was a closet with pretensions: a desk, a filing cabinet, the pegboard with its hooks, the small window that looked out onto the alley and showed her the brick wall of the building opposite, and, at the far left edge of the frame, a slice of the alley mouth where it opened onto the side street. The orange keychain was where she said it was. She grabbed it and turned, and Roman was already at the supply door at the back of the office, the one she used for deliveries, and she could hear, faint but getting less faint, the sound of someone trying the front door of the store. The padlock opened on the second try. Cold air came in from the alley, salt and exhaust, and something organic and unpleasant from the restaurant 2 buildings down. Roman went out first, scanned left and right in the way she recognized from a long time ago when she'd first understood what it meant to be near someone who treated every threshold as a potential last one, then pulled her through. "Call your men," she said. "Already did. They're moving." "And Owen, I need you to get him down here." She looked at him. "You want me to bring my 9-year-old into an alley?" "I want him not to be in an apartment above a door 2 men are currently trying to open." "Yes." He held her gaze. "Your call." She was already going back through the supply door, taking the stairs 2 at a time, and Owen was on the landing exactly where she'd expected him to be. The landing between the first and second floor, book still in hand, wearing the dinosaur socks, watching her come up the stairs with an expression that was trying to be calm and not quite achieving it. "We're going out," she said. "Now?" "Right now. Leave the book." He set it down on the landing step with the particular careful precision that meant he was frightened and managing it, and she took his hand and they went back down together, and the sound from the front of the store was louder now. Not the door anymore, but something else, something lower, the sound of the building itself being stressed at a point she couldn't identify. Roman was in the alley. He'd moved 10 feet toward the alley mouth and was watching the side street with his back to the brick wall, his phone to his ear, talking in a low, rapid voice that she caught fragments of. Compromised, unknown number, 2 on foot, possibly more, sweep the east side. He turned when he heard them come out, and his eyes went to Owen with an expression she was categorically not going to process right now. "My men have the front. There are 2 others unaccounted for." He looked at Nora. This wasn't a surveillance visit. They came in too fast. They knew the building, knew the layout. "How?" "That's what I'm trying to—" He stopped, looked at his phone. Something on the screen made his jaw set in a way she recognized as the suppression of a significant reaction. "Get against the wall." She moved Owen to the wall and put herself in front of him automatically, the 9-year-old muscle memory of motherhood overriding everything else, and Roman stepped in close to her, not crowding, just closing the distance so that whatever was on his phone could be seen by both of them. It was a photograph. Recent. The timestamp in the corner said 47 minutes ago. A parking structure, fluorescent lit, the familiar shape of the 2 black SUVs that constituted Roman's security detail in this town. And standing beside one of the vehicles, in conversation with a man she didn't recognize, was a figure she did. Marcus Webb, Roman's head of security for 11 years. The man who had organized today's visit, who had arranged the route, the timing, the personnel, who had known before anyone else that Roman intended to visit the Harwick property personally. Roman stared at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen directed at her, but had heard about, had caught glimpses of from a safe distance. The expression that meant every available resource was being redirected toward a single point of focus, and that point of focus was survival, and everything peripheral to survival had been suspended. "Marcus?" she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "I don't know yet." "Best guess." He looked at her. "Long enough to know about you. Long enough to feed your location to Silas. Long enough to make sure that when I came here today, I came without knowing the ground was already cut out from under me." He said it flatly, not performing the betrayal, just processing it as information. Long enough. Owen, behind her, said nothing. She could feel him pressed against the wall, one hand at her back, and she could feel that he was not moving and not making a sound, which was the Owen version of extreme competence under pressure,
and she felt a fierce, inarticulate love for him that sat right alongside the terror. "There's a way out of this alley," she said. "Through the restaurant. The owner owes me. She's been getting her employee paperback orders through me for 3 years, and I've got a key to the service entrance." Roman looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. "You've thought about this?" "I think about everything." She met his eyes. "I have thought about every exit from every building I've occupied for 9 years. That's not paranoia, that's survival," he said. "Yeah." And something in the way he said it, quiet, without judgment, without the trace of anything except recognition, cracked the thing in her chest open just slightly wider. Lead. The restaurant was closed at this hour, the service entrance dark, the kitchen smelling of last night's fryer oil and industrial cleaner. Nora moved through it without hesitation because she had walked this path in her head 300 times, and the real version was only different in its smell and the sound of her son's breathing behind her. Roman came last, pulling the service door shut behind him, and they moved through the kitchen and through the swinging door into the dining room and out through the side exit onto the parallel street. Her car was 2 blocks east. They made it in under 4 minutes. Owen got in the back without being told. Roman took the passenger seat. Nora had the key in the ignition before his door was fully closed, and she pulled out without looking like she was hurrying, because looking like you were hurrying was what got you noticed. And 9 years had made her very good at moving fast while appearing to move at a normal speed. "Where are we going?" Owen said from the back. "Somewhere safe." "Where is somewhere safe?" "I'm working on it." "Mom." "Owen, I need you to be quiet for about 10 minutes. A pause. "Okay. Then, is this about the men outside the store?" She didn't answer. In her peripheral vision, she caught Roman turning his head to look at her, a small movement, and she caught his expression in the rearview mirror instead, something complicated and undefended that she didn't have the bandwidth to interpret right now. She drove. Claire's house was 4 miles from the coast, down a road that technically didn't appear on most GPS applications because it had been a private access road until 1987, and the mapping services had never quite caught up. Nora had known this for years. She had known it the way she knew all the specific, unglamorous details of her terrain. Not because she'd researched it deliberately, but because she was someone who had learned to read the geography of wherever she lived as a matter of quiet, continuous necessity. Clara met them at the door in a bathrobe and reading glasses and did not appear remotely surprised, which said something about Clara that Nora had always admired. She looked at Owen, looked at Roman, looked at Nora. "Kitchen," she said. "I'll put coffee on. The boy can sleep in the back room." "I'm not tired," Owen said. "The boy can lie down in the back room and not sleep then." She said it with the particular warmth of someone who had been dealing with children for 50 years and found them almost universally manageable. "Come on, I've got 3 kinds of cereal and absolutely no interest in whatever the adults need to discuss." Owen looked at Nora. She nodded. He went with Clara without further argument, which was either trust or the dinosaur socks having some kind of calming effect. And Nora stood in the hallway with Roman and listened to the sound of the kitchen, the cereal boxes, Clara's low voice saying something that made Owen make a small sound that was almost a laugh. Then she turned to Roman and they went into the sitting room and she said, "Tell me about Marcus." Marcus Webb had come to Roman 11 years ago through a recommendation chain that traced back, it now appeared, through 2 intermediaries who had both subsequently left the organization under circumstances that Roman had at the time classified as unrelated. He had been meticulous, loyal-seeming, the kind of employee whose very thoroughness made auditing him feel like an insult. He had organized Roman's security for over a decade, which meant he had organized Roman's exposure. Every location, every route, every personal visit to every property, every deviation from standard protocol, including, apparently, a deviation 3 years ago when Roman had begun running quiet searches on a woman named Nora Bennett in a coastal town 4 hours from New York. "You searched for me," Nora said. "Indirectly. I had people looking the way I always had people looking. But 3 years ago I narrowed the parameters. I had a lead on a specific description, a specific region. I was close." He stopped. Marcus would have seen those searches. He ran the data security on all internal investigations. And he told Silas. And Silas told him to document everything and wait. Roman's voice was even and utterly controlled, which meant he was somewhere beyond anger into something colder. They've been watching you for 3 years, and I walked into it. I came here personally, which is what they wanted. Get me out of New York, away from my own infrastructure, on unfamiliar ground. Marcus made sure the security detail was compromised before we left the city. I came here thinking I had protection, and I had... He stopped. A cage, she said. He looked at her. Yeah? The coffee Clara brought was strong and too hot, and Nora drank half of it without tasting it, sitting in the armchair across from Roman on the small sofa, and for a moment the domesticity of it, the two of them in an ordinary sitting room, coffee mugs, lamplight, was so dissonant with the shape of the evening that she felt something dangerously close to hysterical laughter rise in her throat and pressed it back down. What does Silas actually want? She said. Walk me through it. Not generally. Specifically, what is he trying to accomplish tonight? Roman turned the coffee mug in his hands. He wants Owen. The cold again, the vertebral cold. As leverage, she said. As a demonstration. He takes Owen. He demonstrates to every remaining senior figure in the organization that I can be reached. That I have a vulnerability that didn't exist before tonight. And once he's demonstrated that, he set the mug down. He offers me a choice. Step aside, legitimize his control, walk away. Or don't. And find out what a man like Silas does with the things you love. She said nothing for a long moment. And if you step aside, then he controls one of the most significant criminal and financial networks on the Eastern Seaboard. The legitimate businesses I've spent 5 years building, the ones with real oversight, real accountability, real attempts at something other than what my father built, those get absorbed and gutted. And every person whose situation improved because I decided to stop doing business the way it had always been done, he stopped. It matters. I know how that sounds, coming from me. But it matters. I know it matters. She said it without inflection, and it was true. She had known him once, and the thing that had made him extraordinary and the thing that had made him dangerous were the same thing, the same absolute conviction that what he decided was important, and that conviction was now sitting in Clara's sitting room, drinking coffee in a $1,200 suit, and she was profoundly tired of feeling things about it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. She answered it because the evening had reached a point where additional threats were information rather than escalation. A voice she didn't recognize said, Ms. Bennett, I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Mercer. He wanted you to know that the back room of the diner on Hartwell Street was swept 20 minutes ago. He also wanted you to know that he's aware you're not there. A pause. He extends his regards. He says the boy takes after his father. The line went dead. Nora lowered the phone. Roman had watched her face during the call, and he was already standing. They're not at the store anymore, she said. They're looking. How many people know about Clara's? Here? In this town? She thought about it. 6? Maybe 8? That's too many. I know. She stood. I need to think. I need 5 minutes to... And then Clara appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, and her face was wrong. Not frightened. Clara had too much iron in her for frightened, but tight. The face of someone managing information they'd have preferred not to have. And behind her in the hallway was Owen. And behind Owen, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder with the particular lightness that communicated total control, was a man Nora had never seen before. He was compact, middle-aged, with the kind of face that was designed to be forgettable. He was wearing a gray coat, and he was not holding a weapon visibly, but his posture communicated the absolute irrelevance of that fact. Ms. Bennett, he said. Mr. Vale. Mr. Mercer sends his apologies for the intrusion. He looked at Owen with an expression of professional blankness that was somehow worse than anything more readable would have been. He'd like to speak with you, both of you. He suggests you leave the boy here with... A glance at Clara. The woman. As a gesture of good faith. Owen was standing very still. His eyes found Nora's.
He wasn't afraid exactly. He was doing the thing he did, reading, assessing, holding the information. But underneath it, she could see the effort it was costing him to hold that stillness, and the sight of it, the sight of her 9-year-old working that hard to be brave in a hallway in his dinosaur socks, did something to her that bypassed every rational process she had. Roman said, "Take your hand off my son." The word landed in the hallway like a dropped weight. His son. The man in the gray coat looked at Roman with mild professional assessment and did not move his hand. And Nora felt something she hadn't felt in 9 years of carefully managed survival. Not fear, not the cold vertebral dread that had become her baseline, but something that started in her sternum and moved outward, something that was almost indistinguishable from rage. And she understood, in the particular clarity of that moment, that she had spent 9 years running from the thing that was now standing in a hallway with its hand on her child, and that the running was over, not because she'd chosen to stop, but because the thing had finally gotten close enough for her to see it clearly and see it for what it was. Not invincible. Just a man in a gray coat who had made the catastrophic miscalculation of walking into a house where 2 people with nothing left to lose were now standing 4 feet away from him, and who did not yet understand that the arithmetic of this situation had just changed completely. She looked at Roman. He looked at her. 9 years of silence and distance and manufactured absence collapsed into a single shared instant of understanding that needed no words, no negotiation, no history to explain it. Just the 2 of them, reading the same room, reaching the same conclusion at the same moment. She moved left. Roman moved right. And the man in the gray coat had exactly enough time to understand that he had made a very serious error before Roman's hand closed around his wrist, with the particular force of a man who had spent a decade carrying the weight of an empire and was now directing all of it at a single point. And the hand left Owen's shoulder, and Owen stepped back against the wall with the reflexive precision of a child who had been, Nora realized, listening to her talk about exits and sightlines and the geometry of safe rooms for his entire life. The man went down. Clara, without any visible alarm, stepped over him and put her hand on Owen's back and moved him toward the kitchen. The man on the floor looked up at Roman and said, with the flattened affect of someone recalibrating, "Mr. Mercer said you'd do that." "Good," Roman said. "Then he'll know what's coming next." He crouched down until he was at eye level with the man. "Tell me where he is." "I don't." "Tell me where he is." The man looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "The Harwick building. He's been in the building since 3 this afternoon. Sub-basement level. There's a facility that—" He stopped. Roman waited. "That Silas had built," the man said, 2 years ago. During the renovation permits. The building inspector was— He stopped again. "Was what?" Roman said. "Was Marcus's cousin," the man said, and something in his voice that was not quite shame passed through it like a weather front. "They built a facility. Below the bookstore. Mr. Mercer has been operational from there for 6 weeks." Nora had been standing in the hallway listening to this and feeling the information stack and settle and reconfigure everything she understood about the building she had lived in for 7 years. Below the bookstore. Below the place where Owen did his homework and she sorted invoices and they ate dinner on the second-hand table with the wobbly leg that she'd been meaning to fix since the previous spring. Below everything she'd built. He had been there, not watching from a distance, not surveilling through cameras or reports or photographs taken through telephoto lenses. There, present, operational. Below her floors for 6 weeks, while she ran the register and helped customers find books, and told herself the careful, ordinary life she'd constructed was solid and real and hers. She looked at Roman. He looked at her. "He's in the building," she said. "Yes." "My building." "Yes." She felt the rage she'd found in her sternum move through her and settle into something colder and more purposeful. The thing that rage becomes when there's no longer any point in feeling it, and every available resource needs to redirect toward use. "Then that's where we're going," she said. Roman studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read and didn't have time to try. "Nora," he said, "what I'm about to walk back into, I can't promise you. I know what you can't promise." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for promises.
I'm asking for the truth about what's in that sub-basement and how many people Silas has with him and what the exits look like. A beat. Can you give me that? He could. And in the back of Claire's house, Owen sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal he wasn't eating and listened to the adults in the hallway make a plan, and understood, with the particular acuity of a child raised by a woman who had never once allowed herself to be helpless, that whatever came next was going to require something from all of them that none of them had been tested on before. He straightened his spine against the kitchen chair. He finished the cereal. He waited. They left Clara's house at 11:43. Roman had 2 men he trusted, actually trusted, which was a number that had dropped precipitously in the last 3 hours, positioned at the north end of Hartwell Street. Not Marcus's people. 2 men who had been with Roman before Marcus, before the organization had grown into something that required a head of security, men who had known him when he was 30 and inheriting a disaster and trying to hold something together with insufficient tools and too much stubbornness. He reached them by a number that wasn't in any organizational directory and told them the address and told them to come dark, no vehicles on the main street, and they said yes without asking why, because that was the thing about trust that had survived long enough. It didn't require explanation. Nora drove. Roman sat beside her with the man from Clara's hallway, said, conscious, zip-tied, at the wrists, with a length of cord Clara had produced from a kitchen drawer with remarkable efficiency, in the back seat. The man's name, it had emerged, was Garrett. He had worked for Silas Mercer for 4 years and was currently engaged in the particular calculus of someone who had chosen the wrong side and was now trying to determine whether cooperation constituted a path to something better than the alternative. The sub-basement, Roman said. How many entrances? 2, Garrett said. 1 through the building's original cellar. There's a door behind the water heater on the basement level. 1 external through a panel in the alley wall. It looks like a utility access. I know that panel, Nora said, without taking her eyes off the road. I always thought it was the gas company's. It was. Until Silas bought the access rights through the building's infrastructure contract 18 months ago and had it reconfigured. Garrett's voice was flat and cooperative in the way of someone who had made the calculation and committed to it. The external entrance is faster, but it's also monitored. He'll know if anyone uses it. And the internal one. Also monitored, but the cameras are on a 10-second loop. Old system. He kept meaning to upgrade it. A pause. He kept meaning to do a lot of things. Roman looked at Nora. She was watching the dark road, her hands at 10 and 2, her jaw set with the particular tension that meant she was running numbers she wasn't sharing yet. He'd spent 9 years without her and had become accustomed to the absence, had built his entire operational life around the absence, and now she was 3 feet away in a dark car driving towards something that could kill them both, and the proximate feeling was one he hadn't expected. Not fear for himself, but something more specific and more disabling. The precise fear of watching someone capable of surviving do something that survival was not guaranteed for. He hadn't had someone to be afraid for in 9 years. He'd forgotten what it cost. The loop, he said. 10 seconds means we have 10 seconds from the door to cover. He looked at Garrett. Cover to where? There's a storage area immediately inside, industrial shelving. If you're flat against the east wall before the loop resets, you're outside the camera angle. And past the storage area. Corridor, 40 feet, 3 doors, such. First 2 are utility, third is the main operations room. That's where he'll be. How many people with him? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Garrett, Roman said. 6 when I left, possibly more. He had additional contractors arriving at 9. Another pause. They're not organizational people. They're outside hire. The kind you use for... He stopped. For what? Nora said. For situations that aren't supposed to leave records, Garrett said, and set it to the back of her headrest, not meeting her eyes in the mirror. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Roman watched her absorb it and understood that she had spent 9 years developing the capacity to receive terrible information without externally fracturing, and that this capacity was going to be necessary for what came next, and that he was grateful for it and furious at the circumstances that had built it in her simultaneously. Stop here, he said. She pulled to the curb a block from the Harwick building, engine idling. The building was dark from this angle. 2 floors of commercial space, the residential above, the facade he'd reviewed in acquisition documents 6 weeks ago without knowing what was underneath it. Literally underneath it. Beneath the floors where a woman he'd been trying to find for 9 years had built a life out of stubbornness and secondhand shelving. His 2 men materialized from the shadows at the north end of the block, with the unhurried competence of people who had been doing this long enough that the doing of it had become unremarkable. Denny, 53, former military, who had been with Roman since the first year, and had the particular quality of stillness that came from having survived many situations that looked worse than this one. And Cal, 46, who had a broken nose that had healed slightly wrong, and who communicated primarily in short sentences and direct action, and who Roman trusted with the uncomplicated completeness of long shared history. They looked at Garrett in the back seat. They looked at Roman. "Sub-basement," Roman said. "Internal entrance, basement level behind the water heater, 10-second camera loop, east wall for cover, 6 confirmed inside, possibly more, outside contractors. Main operations room at the end of a 40-foot corridor." Denny said, "Silas Mercer." "Yes," Cal said, "Huh." Which, from Cal, constituted a substantial response. "I'm going in with you," Nora said. Roman turned to look at her. "Before you say anything," she said, "consider that I have lived in that building for 7 years, and I know every sound it makes, and every place the floor is soft, and every light switch, and I know the basement because I've been down there for the water heater and the circuit breaker and the storage unit I rent on the north side. And I know the alley entrance because I've walked past it 3,000 times, and my knowing all of that is an operational advantage." She met his eyes without blinking. "Consider that." He considered it. He also considered the alternative, leaving her in the car with Garrett while he went into a building with 6+ armed contractors, which was not a secured position regardless of how it felt, and the math was what it was. "You stay behind Denny," he said. "You don't move without instruction. If I tell you to go, you go. No argument." "Agreed." "Nora." "I said agreed, Roman." He held her gaze for one more second, then turned back to the building. "Let's go," he said. "Don't." The Harwick building's main entrance was locked and alarmed, which they went around. The service alley ran along the east side, narrow enough that 2 people couldn't walk abreast comfortably, smelling of refuse and damp concrete, lit by a single overhead fixture at the far end that provided enough light to see by, and not enough to be comfortable. Nora had walked this alley 700 times, carrying recycling and inventory boxes, and she walked it now with different weight. Not heavier, exactly, but differently distributed, the weight of knowing what was underneath the pavement. The building's service entrance required a key she had. Inside, the smell of old wood and heating oil and the particular close darkness of a building at night, familiar to her in a way that felt newly strange, like a face you know, in a context you don't. She'd come down here in the middle of the night for the circuit breaker when the upstairs blew a fuse, and she'd been alone and unbothered by the dark because she'd known this dark, known its specific quality, and now she understood she'd been wrong about what she was alone with. The water heater was where it had always been, squat and industrial, in the northeast corner of the basement, and behind it, visible now that she was looking for it, not visible when she hadn't been, a door. Metal-framed, set flush into the concrete block wall, with a keypad entry and a camera mounted above it at a slight downward angle. Roman looked at Garrett, who had been brought along for exactly this moment. "Code," Roman said. Garrett said the code. Roman looked at Denny. Denny had a phone out with a timer set and was watching it with the focused patience of someone for whom 10-second windows were not a novel problem. "On my mark," Denny said. The camera's red light blinked its slow blink. "Now." Roman punched the code. The door opened inward, silent and heavy, and they moved through it. Roman first, then Nora, then Cal, Denny last, pulling the door shut behind them, and they moved left, east wall, flat against concrete that was cool and slightly damp and smelled of recent construction, and they held position while Nora counted in her head, and at 9 she exhaled, and at 10 the red light on the camera inside the storage room blinked its reset, and they were in the angle, and the angle held. Storage room, industrial shelving, exactly as Garrett described, stacked with equipment cases and electrical conduit, and what appeared to be server hardware still in manufacture packaging. The floor was poured concrete, new, with drainage channels cut into it. The ceiling was low, 6 to 8, maybe 7 feet, with exposed conduit and LED strips that were currently off. The room lit only by the bleed from a light source further in. The corridor. 40 feet of poured concrete with 2 utility doors on the left side and light coming from under the third door at the end, and sound, low, indistinct, the sound of multiple people in a contained space, the occasional word rising above the baseline without enough clarity to identify. Roman moved first. Nora stayed behind Denny as agreed, not because she needed the instruction, but because she had agreed to it, and she kept agreements. The floor was new enough that it didn't creak. Their footsteps were almost silent. She'd worn flat-soled shoes because she always wore flat-soled shoes, and this was one of the 1,000 small choices that had always been survival strategy and had always looked like ordinary preference. 10 feet, 20. From inside the third door, a voice she didn't know said something that resolved into, said he'd be here by midnight, and another voice responded with something she didn't catch. 30 feet. They stopped, backs to the wall, outside the door, and Roman looked at Cal, and Cal looked at the door and held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the top and bottom of the door frame, hinge side, handle side, and made a gesture that was too practiced and too specific for her to entirely follow, but that Denny clearly understood, because he repositioned without a word. Roman looked at her. She looked back at him. He held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. The door came in and everything happened in the compressed, non-linear way of genuine violence. Not the sequential narrative she'd built from secondhand knowledge and old films, but the actual thing, which was faster and louder and had no formal structure, just a series of immediate problems requiring immediate solutions in a space that kept changing. The operations room was large. She registered this in the first second, larger than she'd imagined. The full footprint of the building's ground floor above, but lower, the ceiling barely clearing Roman's head, the space filled with the particular infrastructure of a long-term covert operation. Folding tables with laptops, monitors, a communication setup on the far wall, overhead lights that flooded everything the moment they came in with the clinical brightness of fluorescence. 6 people. She'd counted 6 before Roman and Cal had reached the nearest 2, and then the count changed in ways she didn't track because she was moving along the east wall, low, toward the communications equipment, because she had a specific purpose, and the purpose required the communications equipment, and Denny was 2 feet behind her, covering the angle back toward the door. Someone shouted. Something broke. Glass or plastic, something with that specific splintering report. She reached the communications setup. She knew what she was looking for because Garrett had described it in the car. Silas's primary connection to the additional contractors he'd arranged. The authorization system through which the night's operation was being coordinated. Garrett had given her a sequence. Not a code exactly, but a procedural reversal. The kind of thing that only made sense if you understood the system from the inside, which Garrett did, and she now did by extension. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with the detached, informational clarity of adrenaline and pressed them flat against the table for 1 second and felt the tremor pass and then began. Behind her, impact sounds, shouted fragments, Roman's voice saying something clipped and directive, Cal's voice saying nothing because Cal communicated primarily through action. She did not look. Looking was not her job right now. Her job was this keyboard and this sequence and the 30 seconds Garrett had estimated it would take. She was on second 15 when a hand closed on her shoulder. Not Roman's hand, not Denny's. Denny had gone down with a grunt she'd registered in her peripheral hearing and filed as information. A different hand, heavier, with a grip that yanked her backward and off the chair with enough force that she went to one knee on the concrete floor and felt the impact shoot up through her leg like a wire pulled taut. She looked up. The man was large and professionally blank, the specific blankness of contracted violence, and he had her by the upper arm and was pulling her upright in the way of someone for whom her preferences about the matter were entirely beside the point. And she did the thing she'd read about and never tested and never quite believed would work outside the theoretical. She went with the pull instead of against it, used its momentum, got her feet under her faster than he expected, and drove her elbow into the junction of his jaw and neck with everything she had. He didn't go down. He did, however, release her arm, which was sufficient. She turned back to the table. Second 22, 23, 24. Nora, Roman's voice. From across the room, the particular tone of it, not urgent, not panicked, something more controlled and therefore more alarming, made her look. Silas Mercer was standing in a door she hadn't noticed on the far wall, a door that must have connected to another section of the facility, and he was exactly what she'd expected from 9 years of imagining the shape of the thing that had destroyed her life. Middle-aged, compact, with a face that was neither remarkable nor forgettable, the face of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had learned to use it. He had a gun. This was not particularly remarkable, given the room. What was remarkable was what he had in his other hand. It was a phone. And on the phone's screen, visible from across the room with the specific clarity of a screen at full brightness in a low-lit space, was a live feed. Clara's kitchen. Owen at the table. Clara beside him, and 2 men standing at the kitchen entrance that Nora had not seen when she left. Silas looked at her. He looked at Roman. He said, "I want to talk about a transition of power," in the tone of someone who believed they controlled all the available variables and was simply waiting for the other parties to recognize this. Specifically, I want to talk about what happens to that kitchen in the next 5 minutes, depending on what you two decide to do right now. Second 29. Her finger was on the final key. Roman was looking at her with the expression she'd seen once before tonight. The shared room, same conclusion expression, the one that needed no words, and what it was saying now was, "You're close, I see you, I need 30 more seconds." She looked at Silas. She took her hand off the keyboard. "Okay," she said, "let's talk." Silas's attention moved fully to her, which was what she needed, which was the point. She was 9 years past being someone who needed to be told what the point was. Roman moved 3 feet to the left in her peripheral vision, unhurried, the way water moves when you're not watching it. Silas said, "The Veil organization's leadership passes formally to—" "Before we get into specifics," Nora said, and her voice was steady, in the way of something that had been pushed past its natural range and found a new register on the other side of fear, "I want to understand something." Silas looked at her with the mild tolerance of someone who expected to win. 9 years ago, she said, you sent me a photograph and a letter. You built a lie specifically sized to fit what I was afraid of. And it worked. She held his gaze. You're good at that, reading what someone needs to believe and giving it to them. A beat. What do you need to believe, Silas? Something moved in his expression. Not much. Enough. That I'll let you walk out of here, she said, if you put the phone down. That Roman will give you what you want if you guarantee Owen's safety. That you're in control of this room. She held his eyes. You need to believe all of that, she said. So here's the question. How do you know which parts are true? Silas blinked, and Roman's hand came down on the phone in a motion that crossed the room in less time than the blink, and the feed went dark, and Silas turned toward him, and Nora's hand went back to the keyboard and hit the final key. The communications board went dead. All of it. Screens, indicators, the routing system that connected Silas's contractors to their authorization source, dark and silent in the space of a second, and from somewhere above them, through the concrete and the wood and the accumulated weight of 7 years of her life, she heard nothing, because the building was doing what buildings did, which was hold everything up regardless of what happened underneath. Silas looked at the dead screens. He looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at Roman, who was 2 feet away, and who had the expression of a man who had made the decision so far back that the execution of it was simply a formality. And Silas, for the first time since he'd walked through that door, looked like something he hadn't looked like yet. He looked like a man whose numbers had come out wrong. Your contractors, Roman said quietly, just lost their authorization feed and their communication link and any confirmation of payment transfer that was supposed to go through in the next 20 minutes, which means 6 men upstairs who were hired for a specific job just became 6 men in an unsecured location with no payment confirmation and no operational direction. He took 1 step forward. How long do you think it takes a man like that to decide the job's not worth the exposure? Silas said nothing. Put it down, Roman said. The gun didn't move, and from the ceiling above them, from the floor of the store, from the space that Nora had built and filled and lived in and raised a child inside, came a sound that neither of them had been prepared for. A crack, low and structural, followed by the groan of wood under stress that was no longer being managed, and a section of the old flooring above them, the section near the staircase, the section she'd been meaning to have reinforced for a year and a half, began to come down. Not fast, not all at once, but coming, in the way of old things that have been holding on longer than they were meant to and have finally reached the limit of what holding on can do. Silas looked up. Roman looked up. Nora was already moving because she knew that floor, knew exactly where it was weakest, knew what was above it, the staircase, the landing, the place where Owen had left his book. And the knowing moved through her like current, and she crossed the room in the time it took the first section of flooring to drop 3 inches and hang suspended in the dust in the fluorescent light, and she grabbed Roman's arm and pulled, not because he needed pulling, but because forward momentum required a point of initiation, and she was the one who knew which way to go. "The storage room," she said. "Now, there's a support column, northeast corner." And Silas Mercer raised the gun, and the ceiling came down between them. And the last thing she saw before the dust took the room was his face, and what was on his face was not what she'd expected. Not rage, not calculation, but something much simpler and much worse. The face of a man who had decided that if he was going under, he was not going under alone. The ceiling came down in sections, not the catastrophic collapse of something that had been waiting to fall, more the reluctant surrender of something that had been holding on through stubbornness alone. The old floor joists giving way in sequence like dominoes falling in slow motion, each one releasing the next with a groan that was almost organic, almost the sound of something alive choosing to let go. Plaster dust came first, then splinters, then a section of the staircase landing that hit the sub-basement floor 6 feet from where Nora was standing and broke apart on impact with a crack that she felt in her back teeth. She was already moving. Roman was with her. She could feel him behind her, one hand at her back, not pushing, just present, the physical fact of him in the choking dust. And they went northeast, toward the support column she'd told him about. The original structural concrete that predated everything Silas had built down here and would predate whatever came next. The column held. Around it, the ceiling continued its slow negotiation with gravity. Another section dropped, further west, taking out 2 of the folding tables and a monitor that went to static and then dark. The fluorescence flickered, held, flickered again. In the gaps between the sounds of falling wood, she could hear shouting from above, from the building's main floor, from the street outside. The specific register of voices that meant the situation had moved past the ability of any one person to contain it. She put her back against the column and took stock. Roman beside her. A gash along his left forearm, sleeve dark with blood, not arterial. She registered this with the triage clarity of a woman who had spent 9 years as the only adult in a household and had learned to assess injury the way she'd learned everything else, from necessity. He was upright and functional. That was what mattered. Denny was across the room, back against the east wall, also upright. He had one eye swollen nearly shut and was holding his left side in the way of someone with cracked ribs who had decided the cracked ribs were not the relevant problem right now. The contractors, what remained of them, the ones who hadn't made the calculation that the job wasn't worth the exposure and melted back toward whatever exits they'd come in through, were in various states of disorganization in the western half of the room, which was also the half currently receiving most of the ceiling. Silas was not where he'd been. The door in the far wall, the door he'd come through, was open. Nora said, "He ran." Roman said, "Yes." The facility, Garrett said there were multiple sections. "There's another exit." He said it with certainty, and she understood that he'd been holding this information, waiting for the moment it became the necessary piece. Garrett mentioned a secondary egress in the vehicle bay 200 meters north along the underground utility corridor. Old municipal access predates the building. Silas had it mapped. She looked at the door. She looked at Roman. "I know this building," she said. "I don't know what's under it." "I do." He pushed off the column. Garrett was thorough. A pause. Stay here. Roman? The column is solid. The east wall is solid. You're safe here for another 10 minutes at minimum. If I'm not back, he stopped. Something moved across his face that she recognized from 9 years ago as the expression he'd made when he was about to say something he'd rather not say, because saying it made it real. If I'm not back, Denny will get you out through the storage room. Don't wait more than 8 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. 7, she said. I'll wait 7. Something that was almost a smile. Almost. He went through the door. Booked. The utility corridor was exactly as Garrett had described it, and nothing like Roman had pictured from the description, because descriptions of underground spaces never captured their quality. The way sound moved differently, the way the dark was thicker, the way your own breathing became too loud and too close. He moved by the light from his phone, held low, not for stealth, but because the overhead fixtures in this section were old and most of them were dead. The corridor ran north. He ran it. 200 meters, Garrett had said. He counted his paces. Not precisely, because running precise counts required a stillness of mind he did not currently possess, but approximately, and at approximately 180, he heard something ahead of him and stopped. Footsteps. Ahead of him, but not moving away from him. He stopped moving, and the footsteps stopped moving, and in the silence of the underground corridor, Roman understood that Silas had stopped because Silas had also heard something. And what Silas had heard was Roman, and neither of them had any tactical advantage over the other right now that wasn't immediately canceled by the fact that they were both aware of the other's presence. The overhead fixture above Roman, dead when he'd passed it, one of the long dead ones, flickered. Then it came on, dim and brown-yellow, the last effort of a bulb that had been waiting for someone to give it a reason. In its light, 30 feet ahead, Silas Mercer was standing in the corridor with the gun still in his hand. He looked worse than he had upstairs. The dust had gotten into everything, his hair, his coat, the lines of his face, and it made him look older, made him look like what he was, which was a man in his late 50s who had spent a decade building something on a rotten foundation and was now standing in the rubble of it without the dignity of having seen the collapse coming. "You're not going to let me reach the exit," Silas said. "No. There are things you don't know about what I have in place. Contingencies." His voice had the particular flatness of someone running a bluff they know isn't working. "Documentation. If something happens to me, it goes nowhere," Roman said. "You spent the last 6 weeks routing everything through Marcus, and Marcus is in federal custody as of approximately 40 minutes ago." He watched Silas's face for the tell and found it a small tightening around the eyes. "Cal made a call on the way in, old contacts. The irregularities in the acquisition pipeline were enough to open the door. Everything else Silas had routed through Marcus's access was already flagged. They'd been building the case for 4 months. They just needed one more thread to pull." He took 2 steps forward. "You handed them Marcus. I handed them the rest." Silas stared at him. "You've been trying to take this from me for how long?" Roman said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Not the last year, not the last 3. How long, Silas?" The gun was still up, but it was no longer pointing with the certainty it had been pointing with before. Something in Silas's arm had changed. A fatigue. A weight. The specific heaviness of a man who has been carrying a thing for a long time and is close to the limit of what carrying it does for him. 12 years, Silas said. Roman had expected a shorter number. "Before your father died," Silas continued, "and there was something in it now. Not regret, not quite, but the shadow of it, the shape of what regret would look like if it were allowed to form in a man who had long since closed that particular door. Your father was a man who understood what the organization was, what it was supposed to be. You came in and started dismantling it, legitimizing it, cleaning it. His voice carried a weight of contempt that was old and deeply structural. You built a monument to your own need to believe you were different from what he was. I am different from what he was. You're exactly what he was. You just performed the difference." Roman looked at him. "You sent a woman away with a fake photograph and a death threat. She was 26 and pregnant and alone, and she spent 9 years hiding from a lie you made up. You watched her. You had her followed. You put your people inside a building a child was sleeping in and called it operational necessity. He held Silas's gaze. Tell me more about performing the difference. The gun arm dropped 3 inches, not a capitulation, a tiredness. It didn't have to be her, Silas said. That's what you don't understand. She was a variable. If you hadn't... He stopped, started again. If you had just stayed and run the thing the way it was built to be run, she would have been irrelevant. She would have been a woman you got over. You made her important. You made her the reason. And reasons are vulnerabilities. Yeah, Roman said. They are. He reached out and took the gun. Silas let him take it, which was the final answer to the question of what remained in the man when everything else had been stripped away. Not nothing, but something diminished enough that it no longer required guarding. They stood in the bad light of the dying overhead fixture, and Roman looked at the man who had handed his father's empire to him through a deception so precise it had cost him 9 years and a son he hadn't known existed, and he felt what he felt. Not the theatrical rage of someone who needed the feeling to sustain itself, but something real and final and already moving into past tense. There are federal agents upstairs, Roman said. You're going to walk up there with me. Silas said, and if I don't? Then you stay down here, Roman said simply. Your choice. He came up. The building had been evacuated by the time Roman emerged through the basement level into the night air, Silas beside him, federal agents, Cal's contacts, 4 of them, who had arrived with quiet efficiency in unmarked vehicles, waiting on the sidewalk with the professional calm of people who had been preparing for this exact arrest for long enough that the doing of it felt almost anticlimactic. Marcus was already in custody. 3 of Silas's contractors had been detained at the building's exits. 2 more had made it to the street and been picked up 2 blocks east. The 6th had, apparently, made the calculation early and disappeared, which was the kind of loose end that would be resolved in the coming weeks, through channels Roman didn't need to manage personally. Nora came out through the service alley door with Denny at her shoulder, and she stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the building, her building, its lit upper windows, the front windows of the store with their display of new arrivals she'd arranged 3 days ago. And she stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. Roman came to stand beside her. She didn't look at him immediately. The staircase landing, she said. That's what came down. Yes. I've been meaning to have that reinforced for 18 months. I know. She looked at him then, sideways, a look that had too many things in it to name individually. You know. You mentioned it, tonight, before... He stopped. You said you knew where the floor was soft. The staircase landing was soft. She was quiet for a moment. Owen picked out the beanbag chair in the children's section when he was 5 sit. He spent an entire afternoon in it the day it arrived, testing whether it was properly beanbaggy enough, which was a standard he'd developed for himself with no outside input. She paused. I need you to know that. I need you to know what he's like. Roman said, Tell me. So she told him, standing on the sidewalk outside the building that was hers, and that had been compromised without her knowledge, and that was still standing, and Roman listened the way he'd always listened to her, completely, with the full weight of his attention, without interrupting. And she told him about the dinosaur socks and the list he'd kept of her shelving errors, and the book he'd set down on the landing step with careful precision when he was frightened because he was a child who handled being frightened by being careful with things he loved. She told him about 9 years of the ordinary accumulation of a person. She was still talking when Clara's car pulled up to the curb. Chati. Owen got out first. He stood on the sidewalk in the streetlight and looked at the building and looked at the federal vehicles and looked at the man standing next to his mother. And he did the thing he always did, which was to take it all in without immediate comment, let the information settle, and then decide what to say. He looked at Roman. You're bleeding, Owen said, indicating the gash on Roman's forearm with the direct informational tone he used for things he wanted to acknowledge without dramatizing. I'm aware, Roman said. Mom's got bandages in the upstairs bathroom. She keeps them on the second shelf because I used to get into them when I was little and use them as decorations. Roman looked at Nora. She said, That is accurate. She also keeps the good ones hidden in the kitchen, Owen continued. The ones with the non-stick pads. Those are on top of the refrigerator. She thinks I don't know about those, but I've known about them since I was 7. He paused. Are you going to come upstairs? The question on the surface was logistical. Below the surface, it was not. Roman looked at the boy, really looked at him, with the full deliberateness of someone making a decision about how to look at something rather than simply letting the looking happen. And Owen looked back at him with those gray eyes that had been Roman's eyes in a different face for 9 years. And the moment had the particular weight of things that are small on the outside and very large underneath. If that's all right, Roman said, with you. Owen considered this. Clara said you're my dad. The silence extended for 2 seconds. Clara, Nora said. She said I was going to figure it out anyway, and it was better to hear it straight, Owen said, with the tone of someone relaying a position he found reasonable. She also said it was complicated and that complicated things take time and that I didn't have to feel any particular way about it right now. He looked at Roman. So I don't. Right now. But I might later. That's fair, Roman said. Okay. Owen looked at the building again. Can we go upstairs? It's cold. The upstairs was intact. The landing was not. The collapsed section had taken part of the lower staircase with it and would need professional repair before it was safely functional. But the upper floor, the apartment that had been home for 7 years, was untouched in the way that made the ordinary feel miraculous. Which it wasn't. Which was just physics. Just the building doing what good old buildings did. Owen found the kitchen bandages without ceremony and brought them to the table where Roman was sitting with his sleeve rolled up, and Nora cleaned and dressed the gash with the methodical competence of a woman who had been the only adult in a medical emergency for 9 years. And Owen sat across from Roman at the table and watched the procedure with the frank assessment of a child who found most things interesting if he let himself. Does it hurt? Owen said. Yes, Roman said. Mom says it's important to say yes when things hurt instead of pretending they don't. Your mom is right. Owen absorbed this. She's right about most things. She's wrong about the shelving sometimes. He paused. And about the beanbag chair. She said purple was a bad idea, and it's actually perfect. It is a good chair, Nora said, not looking up from the bandaging. You've said that. I'm allowed to change positions when presented with sufficient evidence. Owen smiled. It was Roman's smile, crooked, slightly delayed, arriving like it had taken the scenic route. And Roman saw it, and Nora saw Roman see it, and she pressed the last piece of medical tape down and sat back and let the moment be what it was. In the weeks that followed, the shape of things changed. Federal investigators worked through the Vail Group's records with the thoroughness of people who had been waiting for the access and intended to use it fully. Marcus Webb entered a cooperation agreement within 72 hours of his arrest, which was faster than anyone had predicted and slower than Roman thought it should have been, and the cooperation produced names and documents and financial records that expanded the investigation in directions that would occupy prosecutors for the better part of 2 years. Silas Mercer did not cooperate. He was charged on 43 counts spanning racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and he sat through the preliminary proceedings with the contained, dignified stillness of a man who had made his choices and was not going to spend whatever remained of his dignity relitigating them. His lawyers were very good, and it didn't matter, because the documentation was complete, and the witnesses were credible, and the man who had built 12 years of a parallel empire on the premise that Roman Vail's only real vulnerability was love turned out to have been right about the vulnerability and catastrophically wrong about what it would cost him. Roman spent the first 2 weeks in depositions and then in the offices of lawyers who had been retained for exactly this kind of structural complexity. He was in New York for most of it. He came back on the weekends, the 6-hour drive that he did without a driver because the drive gave him time that depositions didn't, and he arrived each Friday evening with food from a place in the city that Nora had mentioned once, years ago, in a context he hadn't forgotten. And Owen let him in and reported on the week's shelving errors with the systematic precision of someone who had decided that this was his contribution to whatever was being built. And Roman ate at the wobbly table and listened to all of it. The wobbly table leg got fixed eventually. Roman did it himself on a Sunday afternoon in March with a screwdriver from the kitchen junk drawer and a piece of rubber shim he found in the supply room downstairs. It took 12 minutes. Owen supervised and pronounced the results structurally adequate, which from Owen was a strong endorsement. Nora watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, and felt something she was still learning to identify after 9 years of deliberately not allowing herself to feel it. The specific texture of something ordinary being repaired by someone who intended to be there for the repair. The staircase landing took longer. A contractor came in February and shook his head at the extent of it and gave a timeline that Nora revised upward by 30% based on experience, and the revision turned out to be accurate. And by April, the landing was solid and the stairs were sound, and Owen stopped having to use the back staircase to get between floors, which he had been doing without complaint since January, in the particular way he did things he found inconvenient, thoroughly and without commentary. The legitimate work of dismantling took longer than the dramatic work. Roman spent the first year in rooms with lawyers and federal liaisons and compliance officers, working through the organizational structure he'd inherited and then expanded, separating the parts that were genuinely functional from the parts that were functional only in the way that criminal enterprises are functional, which is to say at significant cost to the people at the bottom of the structure who rarely chose to be there. He compensated families, not symbolically, actually specifically, case by case, in amounts determined by the damage rather than by what was comfortable. It cost more than he'd estimated, and he didn't revise the estimate downward. Some people didn't want the money, and he directed those cases to his legal team and let them work through whatever the person actually needed. Some people wanted to talk to him directly, and he did that too, in rooms that were not comfortable and conversations that were not comfortable. And he came out of those rooms each time looking like a man who had been in them. Nora didn't ask him about the rooms. He told her anyway, some evenings on the small sofa above the bookstore, when Owen was asleep and the ocean was doing its constant thing outside and the store was dark below them. He told her without cleaning it up, without the version that made him look better than the material warranted. And she listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without filling the silence prematurely, letting the thing be said in its own shape. "You didn't have to take it on," she said once. "The compensation, the liability work. You could have argued it was inherited." "I know. Why didn't you?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it in the way she'd always valued about him. Not performing the thinking, but doing it. "Because I ran it," he said, "whether I built it or not. I ran it and I benefited from it, and people were harmed by it while I was running it. That's not inherited liability, that's mine." She looked at him for a moment. "Owen asked me last week," she said, "why we have the store." "What did you tell him?" "I told him because books are portals." A beat. "He made that banner when he was 6. He's never stopped believing it's true." She paused. "He asked me if that's why I came here, if I was trying to go somewhere else." "What did you say?" "I said yes." She held Roman's gaze. "I said I was trying to go somewhere safe, and the books were what I used to remember that safe places exist, that someone built them, that they could be rebuilt." Roman said nothing for a moment. "He said that was the best reason for a store he'd ever heard," Nora said. "He's right. He usually is. It's irritating." But she said it with the voice she used for Owen, a voice that was underneath its surface composed almost entirely of the particular love that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The train tickets were Roman's discovery, on a Tuesday evening in late spring. He'd been reorganizing the storage shelf in the back office at Nora's request. She'd finally decided to stop putting off the reorganization she'd been deferring since the previous autumn. And the novel had been on the shelf, spine out, the title worn enough that he'd had to tilt it to read. A novel he recognized. One he'd had a copy of himself once, in an apartment on the west side with a record player and books with white spines. He took it off the shelf. It fell open to a page near the back, the way well-read books fell open to places they'd been left the longest, and the tickets were there, 2 of them, 9 years old, the paper softened at the folds, the printing faded but legible, a departure date that had passed in another era. 2 names, his name, her real name, Evelyn, which she'd given up and which he'd been careful not to use without permission, but which was there on the ticket in the old printing alongside his, The two of them going somewhere together in the future that hadn't happened. He stood in the back office of the bookstore for a long time. He heard Nora come through from the store, heard her stop in the doorway, heard the quality of her silence change when she saw what he was holding. "I couldn't throw it away," she said. "The book or the tickets?" "Either." A pause. "Both." He turned around. She was leaning in the doorway with her arms crossed and her hair loose from the braid she'd started that morning, and she looked like someone who had survived a thing and was still in the process of determining what the surviving had made her. And she looked like Evelyn, and she looked like Nora, and she was both of those people simultaneously in a way that he understood now was not a contradiction. He held up the tickets. She looked at them. "We could go," he said. "Not now, but we could go." She was quiet for a moment. "Owen's never been on a train," she said. "I know." "He'd have opinions about it." "I expect so. He'd probably want to bring at least 4 books for a trip of any length." "I'll bring a bag." She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her face was too layered and too hard won to be called simple happiness. But it was in the vicinity of happiness, on the far side of everything that had stood between her and it for 9 years. The lie, the loss, the long, careful work of building a life from the pieces of something destroyed, and then the longer, harder work of letting the rebuilt thing be touched by someone else without bracing for it to break. She pushed off the doorframe and crossed the small office and took the tickets from him, looked at them once, then slid them back into the book and set the book on the shelf with the spine facing out. "We'll go when the staircase is fully finished," she said. "It's been finished since April." "When Owen's done with his current reading list." "That could be never." "When I've done the quarterly inventory." "Nora." She looked at him. "We don't have to run anymore," he said. The simplicity of it, the extraordinary simplicity of it, landing in the back office of the small bookstore above which they'd spent 9 years apart and several months not. And she felt it. Felt the truth of it move through her the way the cold had moved through her on the worst nights, but different, warm instead of cold, settling instead of unsettling. "I know," she said. She meant it. She could tell, from the way something in him eased, something that had been braced for the past 9 months in the way of a man who had learned not to trust the easing too quickly, that he believed her. But Owen found out about the tickets that evening because Owen found out about most things, and he held them carefully and looked at the faded printing with the focused attention he gave to objects he recognized as having histories. "These are from before I was born," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "You were going to go somewhere." "We were." He looked at both of them. The gray eyes moved from his mother to his father and back with the assessment that was entirely his own. The particular quality of perception that had developed in a child raised by a woman who never condescended to him, surrounded by books that never oversimplified. "We should go," he said. "We're planning to," Roman said. "Soon?" "When your mother's ready." Owen looked at Nora with mild challenge. "The inventory is almost done," she said. "Mom." "I said almost." He looked at her for a long moment with Roman's jaw and Roman's eyes, and the crooked smile that was both of them and neither of them, and entirely its own thing, and then he set the tickets down very carefully on the counter and went back to his book, the one he'd been reading since dinner, which was his way of indicating that the matter was settled as far as he was concerned, and the adults could catch up when they were ready. The store was quiet below them. The ocean was doing what it always did, and the train tickets sat on the counter in the back office above the small bookstore in the quiet coastal town where fate had made a second attempt, and this time had been allowed to complete itself. 2 names on paper, a departure that had been delayed 9 years, and a life, waiting now not with urgency, but with the patient certainty of something that had always known it would eventually be used. They didn't need to run. They were already exactly where they were always meant to be. And this time, they knew it.